Welcome to Beyond the Silent Woods, where we uncover the darkest chapters of America's forgotten history. Before we begin this chilling tale, I invite you to leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is in your location. We're fascinated to know when and where these documented accounts reach our listeners around the world. The brutal winter of 1897 descended upon Sevier County, Tennessee, like a death shroud. Deep in the isolated valleys of the Great Smoky Mountains, where ancient hemlocks towered above morning fog and coal seams ran beneath weathered peaks, the settlement of Ravens Hollow existed in near-total isolation. The nearest town, Gatlinburg, lay 22 miles north through treacherous mountain passes that became completely impassable during heavy snowfall. Here, perched on a narrow ledge overlooking Blackwater Creek, stood a weathered two-story cabin where Margaret Sullivan had lived as a widow for 8 months, following the mysterious death of her husband, Thomas. Thomas Sullivan's death in April 1897 had been officially recorded as a mining accident, though no proper investigation was ever conducted. The nearest sheriff's office was 4 days away by horseback, and mountain communities typically handled their own affairs without outside interference. According to the Sevier County Register of Deaths, Thomas Sullivan, aged 43, died from injuries sustained in a mine collapse on April 19, 1897. The death certificate, signed by local physician Dr. Henry Morrison, listed the cause as crushing injuries to the chest and abdomen. However, a detailed medical report discovered among Dr. Morrison's personal papers during an estate auction in 1963 presents a drastically different account. The report, written in Dr. Morrison's careful handwriting, describes treating Thomas for injuries that appeared completely inconsistent with a mining accident. The wounds showed evidence of being inflicted over several days rather than in a single incident. More disturbing was Dr. Morrison's observation that Thomas, during his final hours, repeatedly spoke about things hidden in the root cellar and expressed terror of returning home to his wife. The medical report contains additional details that Dr. Morrison deliberately omitted from the official death certificate. Thomas arrived at the doctor's residence on April 17th, claiming to have been injured in a mine collapse 2 days earlier. However, his wounds showed no evidence of coal dust or rock debris. Instead, the injuries appeared to be deliberate cuts and punctures administered with surgical precision. More concerning was Thomas's mental state during the 2 days Dr. Morrison treated him before his death. The patient exhibited extreme paranoia, refusing to allow windows or doors to remain open and constantly checking to ensure no one was listening. He claimed that his wife had discovered his secret and was making him pay for his deceptions. When Dr. Morrison pressed for details, Thomas became increasingly agitated and spoke in fragments about promises made to strangers and debts that required unusual payment. He mentioned having brought something into the house that should have remained buried and expressed absolute terror about what Margaret might do with this knowledge. On the evening before his death, Thomas attempted to leave Dr. Morrison's care, insisting he needed to retrieve certain items from the cellar before Margaret used them for purposes he had never intended. Dr. Morrison physically restrained him, noting that the patient's terror seemed genuine. Thomas died during the night from blood loss, but his final words, according to the doctor's notes, were, "She knows about the visitors, and now they'll never leave." Margaret Sullivan was 44 years old at the time of her husband's death. Born Margaret Hayes in nearby Knox County, she had married Thomas in 1872 and moved to his family property in Ravens Hollow. The Sullivan land consisted of 143 acres of heavily forested mountainside, most of it too steep for farming, except for a small clearing where Margaret maintained a vegetable garden and kept chickens and a milk cow. The marriage had been arranged by their families as a practical union between two established mountain clans. According to family correspondence discovered in 1967, during the demolition of an old house in Knox County, the arrangement was motivated by economic considerations rather than romance. Margaret brought a modest dowry and connections to Kentucky trade networks, while Thomas offered the security of mineral rights and established property. Letters written by Margaret to her sister Catherine in Kentucky, found among family papers in 1969, provide insight into the marriage dynamics. The correspondence reveals a relationship characterized by mutual respect but little emotional intimacy. Margaret described Thomas as a practical man who provided adequately, but shared little of his inner thoughts or business dealings. More significantly, the letters document Margaret's growing concern about her husband's secretive behavior, particularly regarding certain areas of their property. In a letter dated February 1894, she wrote, "Thomas has become increasingly protective of the root cellar area and insists I have no need to access that part of our property. He has installed a substantial lock and claims the space is needed for storing mining equipment. Though I cannot understand why such items would require such security, or why he visits that location so frequently during evening hours." A subsequent letter from September 1895 reveals that Margaret's suspicions had deepened. "I have noticed that Thomas occasionally entertains visitors who arrive after dark, and whose presence he does not acknowledge during daylight hours. These meetings appear to occur near the cellar, and I have observed him carrying supplies to that area following such visits." When I inquired about these activities, he became agitated and insisted that I was imagining things, though I am certain of what I have witnessed. The final letter in the collection, dated January 1897, 3 months before Thomas's death, suggests that Margaret had discovered something significant. "I can no longer maintain the pretense of ignorance regarding Thomas's secret affairs. What I have discovered in the cellar area defies explanation and forces me to question everything I believed about the man I married. I cannot discuss details in correspondence, but I will no longer tolerate deception in my own home." If you're still listening to this disturbing account, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Beyond the Silent Woods. Drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Your support helps us continue uncovering these forgotten tragedies. Neighbors were scarce in that part of the hollow. The nearest residents belonged to the Carter family, distant cousins of Margaret, who lived approximately 3 miles down the creek. Jacob and Emma Carter operated a small sawmill and occasionally provided supplies to other families scattered throughout the remote valley. It was Jacob who first expressed concern about Margaret's situation following her husband's funeral. The funeral service for Thomas Sullivan was held on April 21, 1897, at the small Methodist chapel that served Ravens Hollow. Reverend Samuel Bradford, the circuit preacher who traveled between remote mountain communities, conducted the service. His personal journal, preserved among Methodist church archives until their transfer to the University of Tennessee in 1971, contains a detailed account of the funeral that reveals unusual circumstances. According to Reverend Bradford's notes, Margaret insisted on specific arrangements that deviated from normal mountain customs. She requested that the grave be dug to an unusual depth and lined with stones, claiming these measures were necessary due to unstable soil conditions. More unusually, she insisted on personally placing several items in the coffin before burial, including what appeared to be documents and a collection of small metal objects that she would not allow others to examine. Most striking was Margaret's demeanor during the service itself. Rather than displaying expected grief, she appeared alert and focused, frequently scanning the small congregation as if searching for specific individuals. When Reverend Bradford delivered the standard words about eternal rest and peaceful sleep, Margaret audibly disagreed, stating that Thomas would not rest until his obligations were complete. The Reverend noted that Margaret's behavior during the graveside portion was particularly unusual. She remained at the burial site long after other mourners had departed, and when Reverend Bradford approached to offer final consolation, he found her speaking quietly to the freshly covered grave. The words he could distinguish included references to keeping promises and maintaining arrangements that made little sense in the context of a burial service. In a letter dated August 3, 1897, discovered among family correspondence by a genealogist in 1967, Jacob Carter wrote to his brother in Nashville, "Margaret has taken to keeping to herself more than is natural, even for a grieving widow. She comes to trade at the mill only when necessary, and when she does, she speaks little and seems always to be listening for something, as if expecting to hear her name called from the woods. Emma tried to visit last week, but Margaret would not allow her inside the house, claiming she was not prepared for company." The letter continues with more detailed observations about Margaret's changing behavior. What concerns us most is her apparent preoccupation with maintaining extensive correspondence with individuals we do not recognize. She receives mail more frequently than seems reasonable for someone in her isolated circumstances, and the letters arrive through irregular channels rather than normal postal delivery. When questioned about these correspondences, she becomes evasive and changes the subject immediately. Jacob also documented his observations of unusual activity around the Sullivan property. There are signs that Margaret receives visitors despite her claims of isolation. We have observed lamp lights in multiple windows during late evening hours, and there are frequently more horses in her pasture than she owns personally. Most puzzling is evidence of large quantities of food being consumed on the property, far more than a single person would require. The summer of 1897 passed quietly in Raven's Hollow, but beneath this surface calm, disturbing patterns were developing around the Sullivan property. William Reynolds, a merchant who traveled the creek road monthly with supplies for isolated families, began noticing changes in Margaret's purchasing patterns that suggested her household requirements had increased significantly. Reynolds's account books, discovered among his business papers in 1965, show that Margaret's monthly orders had nearly tripled in size following her husband's death. She regularly purchased quantities of flour, salt pork, and other staples sufficient for feeding 6 to 8 people, along with unusual items such as large amounts of rope, metal tools, and lamp oil. When Reynolds questioned these large orders, Margaret explained that she was entertaining more guests than previously and needed to maintain adequate supplies for extended hospitality. More concerning were Margaret's inquiries about the schedules and routes of travelers passing through the region. She showed particular interest in individuals traveling alone or in small groups, especially those whose travel plans were uncertain or who might be delayed by weather conditions. Reynolds noted that she frequently asked about travelers who had not yet arrived in the area, as if she were expecting specific visitors. During one particularly memorable encounter in September 1897, Margaret asked Reynolds to carry a message to potential travelers, offering shelter and supplies to anyone who might be stranded by autumn storms. The message emphasized the isolation of her property and suggested that travelers could find complete privacy and extended rest at her location. Reports from other travelers passing through the area began to accumulate throughout the summer, creating a pattern of unusual encounters with Margaret. A letter written by tobacco merchant Daniel Pierce to his business partner in September 1897 describes an encounter that illustrates Margaret's increasingly predatory behavior. "I stopped at the Sullivan place to water my horses and rest briefly during my journey to Gatlinburg. The widow Sullivan was excessively hospitable, insisting that I remain overnight despite my protests that I preferred to continue traveling. She seemed particularly interested in my travel schedule and pressed me repeatedly for details about who expected my arrival and when they might become concerned if I were delayed." Pierce's letter continues. "Most unsettling was her apparent familiarity with my route and business affairs, despite my belief that this was our first meeting. She mentioned specific clients and destinations that I had not discussed with her, suggesting she had obtained this information from other sources. When I finally insisted on departing, she became visibly disappointed and made several attempts to convince me that remaining overnight would be safer and more pleasant than I might expect. Another account from traveling preacher Robert Campbell to his church supervisors describes an even more disturbing encounter. I arrived at the Sullivan property seeking shelter during a severe thunderstorm in October. The widow received me with great enthusiasm and immediately began preparing accommodations that seemed far more elaborate than necessary for a single night's stay. She spoke frequently about other guests who had found her hospitality so appealing that they had chosen to extend their visits indefinitely. Campbell's letter provides additional details about the unusual atmosphere. Throughout the evening, I heard sounds suggesting the presence of other people in the house, including footsteps, muffled conversations, and what sounded like furniture being moved. However, Mrs. Sullivan insisted that we were alone and attributed these sounds to the settling of the old structure. Most disturbing was her repeated suggestion that I might find the accommodation so comfortable that I would want to make arrangements for a permanent stay. The preacher's account concludes with his hasty departure. I left at dawn without waiting for breakfast, despite Mrs. Sullivan's insistence that leaving so early was unnecessary and potentially dangerous. As I departed, I observed what appeared to be freshly disturbed earth near a large outbuilding behind the house, and the smell of decomposition was noticeable even in the open air. As autumn approached, the pattern of disturbing reports about the Sullivan property intensified. Nathan Morrison, son of Dr. Morrison and a frequent hunter in the area, claimed to have heard what he described as rhythmic digging sounds coming from the direction of the property during the early morning hours. When questioned by his father about these observations, Nathan maintained that the sounds occurred regularly, always before dawn, and always seemed to originate from behind the house near the root cellar. The root cellar had been constructed by Thomas Sullivan the previous year, carved into the hillside approximately 60 yards behind the house. It was an unusually large structure for a family of two, measuring roughly 14 feet by 10 feet and extending back into the hill for nearly 25 feet. Thomas had explained to neighbors that the size was necessary for storing preserved food and maintaining proper ventilation. However, Nathan's observations suggested that the cellar was being used for purposes that extended far beyond food storage. His detailed notes describe evidence of extensive excavation work around the cellar entrance, and signs that the interior structure had been significantly modified. Most disturbing were his reports of seeing Margaret emerge from the cellar during pre-dawn hours carrying what appeared to be bundles of clothing and personal effects that she subsequently burned in outdoor fires. Dr. Morrison's journal, donated to the University of Tennessee by his grandson in 1964, contains an entry dated November 8, 1897, that reflects growing concern within the community. Nathan continues to report unusual activities at the Sullivan place, and his observations are now being corroborated by other community members. Jacob Carter confided today that his wife has expressed reluctance to travel past the Sullivan property, claiming the atmosphere there has become unnatural and that she frequently detects unpleasant odors emanating from the area. The doctor's journal continues. More troubling are reports from traveling merchants and other visitors who describe feeling unnaturally welcome at the Sullivan house, as if Mrs. Sullivan were eager for their company beyond normal mountain hospitality. Several individuals have mentioned feeling pressured to extend their stays despite having urgent business elsewhere. I fear that grief has affected Mrs. Sullivan's mental state more severely than initially apparent, and her isolation may be exacerbating underlying psychological instabilities. The first documented attempt to check on Margaret's welfare occurred on November 15, 1897, when Emma Carter and two other women from the community approached the Sullivan house during daylight hours. According to a letter written by Emma to her sister in Knoxville, the visit produced deeply unsettling results. We found Margaret working in her garden, though it was well past the growing season, and she appeared to be digging rather than harvesting, Emma wrote. When we approached, she looked up with an expression I can only describe as startled, as if she had forgotten that other people existed in the world. Her appearance had changed dramatically since I last saw her in August. She had lost considerable weight, and her clothing hung loose on her frame, yet she seemed to possess nervous energy that made her movements quick and erratic. The letter provides additional details about Margaret's physical transformation. More disturbing were her hands, which were heavily stained with soil and showed evidence of recent cuts and abrasions. Her fingernails were broken and caked with dirt, suggesting extensive manual labor of a type that seemed inconsistent with normal household maintenance. Most unsettling was the intense focus of her attention, as if she were constantly listening for sounds that we could not hear. The women attempted to engage Margaret in conversation about her welfare and to offer assistance with preparations for winter, but their reception was notably cold and evasive. Margaret insisted she required no help and repeatedly glanced toward the root cellar throughout their brief exchange. When Emma suggested organizing a community gathering to help preserve food for winter, Margaret became visibly agitated and insisted that her cellar was already well stocked and that she preferred to manage her own affairs without outside interference. Most concerning was Margaret's response when asked about attending Sunday services or maintaining social connections during the difficult winter months ahead. According to Emma's letter, Margaret replied that she had company enough already, and that entertaining guests required all of her attention and energy. When the women asked for clarification about these guests, Margaret gestured vaguely toward the house and cellar area, stating that her visitors stayed longer than most people would consider normal, but that she found their extended presence very satisfying. The visit concluded abruptly when one of the women mentioned the unpleasant odor that seemed to permeate the entire property. Margaret's reaction was immediate and defensive. She insisted that the smell was merely food preservation processes that were more intensive than most households attempted. However, her explanation was contradicted by the intensity and character of the odor, which the women described as resembling decomposition rather than any normal food storage activity. Emma's letter concludes with her assessment of Margaret's mental state. I left that place with the conviction that grief and isolation have affected Margaret's mind in ways that may pose danger to herself and others. Her behavior suggests she is living in a reality that diverges significantly from actual circumstances. Most troubling was her apparent belief that she was providing hospitality to guests who were present on the property, though we saw no evidence of any other people during our entire visit. Before we continue with what happens next in this horrifying true story, if you're finding this case as disturbing as we are, please hit that like button and subscribe to Beyond the Silent Woods for more forgotten tales of terror. Comment below and let us know what time of day you're listening to this. Are you brave enough to hear this alone at night? Winter arrived early in Ravens Hollow that year. Heavy snows began falling in mid-November, effectively cutting off the area from outside contact until spring. This isolation was typical for Smoky Mountain communities, and families routinely prepared for months of self-sufficiency. However, the extended period without contact allowed concerning behaviors to develop unchecked. Jacob Carter maintained a basic journal of daily activities, primarily tracking weather conditions and noting any unusual events. Entries from December 1897 and January 1898, preserved among family papers found during a 1969 renovation, document increasingly disturbing observations regarding the Sullivan property. December 22, 1897, heavy snow continued for a third day. Creek beginning to freeze at edges, making water access more difficult for all households. Notice smoke from Sullivan chimney, but it appears thin and irregular, suggesting minimal fire for heating. However, window light was visible after midnight on multiple occasions, which seems impractical for normal household management during winter fuel conservation periods. December 28, 1897. No sign of normal holiday preparations at Sullivan Place during daylight hours. Nathan claims to have seen lamplight in multiple windows simultaneously during pre-dawn hours, suggesting either multiple occupants or unusual activity patterns. He also reports detecting wood smoke that carries the scent of burning fabric or leather rather than normal firewood. I instructed him to avoid that area of the hollow until the weather improves and travel becomes safer. January 10, 1898. A brief thaw allowed a short trek to check trap lines and assess winter damage. I passed below Sullivan property and observed that snow around the root cellar area showed significant disturbance despite several days of continuous accumulation. Footpaths are clearly defined between the house and cellar, suggesting regular traffic despite harsh conditions that would normally limit such activity. January 16, 1898. Nathan continued reporting sounds from the Sullivan direction during night hours. He now describes rhythmic striking against the earth, similar to digging, but slower and more deliberate than normal excavation work. The weather has been severe with frozen ground that should make such activity extremely difficult, and I am beginning to question whether Margaret's winter preparations involved projects that extend beyond normal household needs. January 24, 1898. A strange incident today confirms growing concerns about the Sullivan situation. I found items of clothing scattered along the creek bank below the property, including a man's coat of good quality and leather boots that show signs of recent wear. The items appear to have been discarded deliberately rather than lost accidentally. I cannot determine the source, but their presence suggests either unusually careless behavior or more disturbing explanations. February 2nd, 1898. Nathan insists on reporting the discovery of additional personal effects near the creek area, including what appears to be traveling papers and a small bag containing coins. Items seem fresh despite winter conditions and suggest the presence of travelers in the area during a period when such travel should be impossible due to weather. I am growing convinced that unusual activities at the Sullivan property require investigation once conditions permit safe travel. The most detailed account of Margaret's behavior during the winter months comes from an unexpected source. Reverend Samuel Bradford made an emergency journey to Ravens Hollow in February 1898, following reports that several families were experiencing severe hardships due to the extended winter. His detailed report to the Methodist District Conference, archived in the United Methodist Historical Society records until their transfer to the University of Tennessee in 1971, provides crucial insight into Margaret's condition during this period. Reverend Bradford's report, dated March 3, 1898, describes visiting each family in the hollow to assess their needs and provide spiritual counsel. His account of the visit to Margaret Sullivan reveals a situation that had deteriorated far beyond normal grief or isolation. I approached the Sullivan residence on February 26 during a brief break in the weather that allowed travel through the hollow, Reverend Bradford wrote. The property showed clear signs of occupancy, with regularly maintained paths through the snow and consistent chimney smoke. However, the distribution of these paths was unusual, focusing primarily on routes between the house and the root cellar structure, with minimal evidence of practical winter activities such as tending livestock or accessing stored firewood. The Reverend's report provides detailed observations about the physical condition of the property. The cellar structure appeared to have been enlarged significantly, with evidence of recent excavation work despite the frozen conditions that should have made such projects impossible. Large quantities of displaced earth were visible around the excavation site, and the entrance to the cellar had been reinforced with heavy wooden beams that seemed unnecessarily substantial for normal food storage purposes. When Reverend Bradford knocked on the front door, He received no immediate response despite clear evidence that someone was present inside. After waiting several minutes, he heard movement within, and eventually Margaret appeared at the door. The preacher's description of her appearance suggests serious deterioration in her physical and mental condition. Mrs. Sullivan's transformation was shocking, he wrote. She had lost significant weight and appeared to have aged dramatically in the months since I last saw her at her husband's funeral. Her hair, previously neat and properly arranged, hung loose and unkempt, and her clothing, while apparently clean, fit poorly and suggested she had not been eating adequately or maintaining normal personal care routines. More disturbing than her physical appearance was Margaret's mental state and behavior during the interaction. Reverend Bradford noted that her eyes held an intensity that seemed to burn with internal focus, and her attention seemed divided between their conversation and some other concern that required constant monitoring. She frequently paused mid-sentence to listen for sounds that the Reverend could not detect, and her responses to his questions often seemed disconnected from the topics being discussed. When Reverend Bradford attempted to enter the house to provide counsel and assess whether Margaret required assistance, she firmly refused entry, claiming the house was not prepared for visitors and that she was attending to urgent matters that required privacy. Her refusal was particularly notable because mountain hospitality customs strongly emphasized welcoming religious visitors, especially during harsh weather conditions. The Reverend attempted to offer prayer and spiritual counsel from the doorway, but Margaret's responses revealed the depth of her psychological deterioration. When he offered to pray for her deceased husband's eternal rest, she interrupted to insist that Thomas was not resting and that his spirit required constant attention to remain comfortable. She claimed that Thomas communicated with her regularly and had specific needs that only she could fulfill. Most troubling was Margaret's casual mention that she had been preparing accommodations for additional guests because Thomas had indicated he would soon have companions who would require similar care. When Reverend Bradford pressed for clarification about these preparations, she gestured toward the cellar area and explained that she was expanding the facilities to ensure adequate space for everyone who might need permanent arrangements. The Reverend's report documents his growing alarm as the conversation continued. Mrs. Sullivan spoke with perfect sincerity about maintaining ongoing relationships with deceased individuals, as if death were merely a change in circumstances rather than a permanent separation. Her references to guests and companions who required permanent accommodations suggested delusions of a scope that exceeded normal grief responses. When Reverend Bradford gently suggested that Thomas had passed to his eternal rest and that Margaret might benefit from community support in adjusting to widowhood, she became visibly agitated and insisted that the preacher did not understand her situation. She claimed that death was not what most people believed and that proper care could maintain connections that others thought were broken. The visit concluded abruptly when Margaret mentioned that her current guests were resting comfortably in their accommodations and that she needed to check on their needs before the weather deteriorated further. Reverend Bradford attempted to prolong the conversation to better assess her mental state, but she firmly closed the door and could be heard moving through the house toward the rear of the structure. Reverend Bradford's final observations as he departed the property provided additional evidence of unusual activities. As I left the immediate area, I detected a persistent odor that seemed inconsistent with normal winter household activities. The smell was strongest near the cellar structure and resembled decomposition rather than food storage processes. I also observed that the snow around the cellar showed evidence of frequent disturbance, with paths suggesting regular movement of heavy objects between the structure and other areas of the property. The preacher's report concludes with his professional assessment. Mrs. Sullivan exhibits clear signs of severe psychological disturbance that appears to have progressed beyond simple grief responses. Her delusions about maintaining relationships with deceased individuals, combined with her apparent belief that she is providing hospitality to multiple guests, suggest complete detachment from reality. Most concerning is evidence that these delusions are influencing her behavior in ways that may pose dangers to herself, and potentially to others who might encounter her during her current mental state. Spring arrived late in 1898, with snow persisting into early April. Community members began planning visits to check on neighbors who had been isolated during the winter months. However, these plans were disrupted by a discovery that fundamentally changed the community's perception of the situation at the Sullivan property. On April 18, 1898, Nathan Morrison was checking his father's trap lines along Blackwater Creek when he noticed an unusual smell emanating from the direction of the Sullivan property. The odor, which he described as similar to decomposing organic matter but stronger and more persistent than anything he had previously encountered, seemed to originate from the area around the root cellar. Concerned that an animal might have died in the structure during winter, Nathan approached the cellar to investigate. The root cellar door, which had previously been secured with a simple wooden latch, was now fastened with multiple heavy iron locks that appeared newly installed. The smell was strongest near the door, and Nathan noticed that the earth around the entrance showed extensive signs of recent digging. Most unsettling was evidence of large amounts of disturbed soil that had been moved away from the cellar entrance and spread throughout the surrounding area in patterns that seemed deliberately organized. Nathan's investigation revealed additional disturbing details about the modifications made during the winter months. The original wooden entrance had been reinforced with heavy beams, and the structure appeared to have been expanded significantly into the hillside. Most alarming was the discovery of personal items scattered around the cellar area, including articles of clothing, shoes, and personal effects that clearly did not belong to either Margaret or her deceased husband. The items appeared to have been discarded carelessly, as if their owners had no further need for them. Several pieces showed signs of damage that suggested forcible removal, and some articles bore what appeared to be dark stains that could not be easily explained. Nathan immediately reported his observations to his father, Dr. Morrison, who recorded the incident in his journal entry for April 18th. Nathan's report regarding conditions at the Sullivan root cellar confirms my growing suspicions that Mrs. Sullivan's mental state has deteriorated significantly during the winter isolation. The installation of excessive security measures and apparent excavation activities suggest irrational behavior, possibly connected to her persistent delusions about maintaining relationships with deceased individuals. Dr. Morrison decided that the situation warranted immediate investigation and organized a small group of community leaders to visit Margaret and assess her welfare. However, before this confrontation could occur, additional discoveries near the property forced the community to confront possibilities that extended far beyond simple mental illness. On April 19, 1898, William Reynolds, the traveling merchant, arrived in Ravens Hollow for his first supply run since winter began. His route took him along the creek road directly below the Sullivan property, and his subsequent report to the community added a new and disturbing dimension to the growing concern. According to Reynolds's account, the Sullivan property showed signs of significant activity that seemed inconsistent with a single-person household. Multiple paths were worn through the remaining patches of snow, and there appeared to be evidence of recent construction or modification work around multiple structures on the property, not just the root cellar. When Reynolds stopped to investigate further, hopping to offer supplies to Margaret and check on her welfare, he made a discovery that immediately sent him seeking help from other community members. Near the creek bank, partially concealed by fallen logs and early spring vegetation, he found items of clothing and personal effects that clearly did not belong to either Margaret or her deceased husband. The items included a man's coat of good quality, a leather satchel containing traveling papers, and most disturbingly, personal effects that Reynolds recognized as belonging to missing travelers he had been asked to watch for during his previous routes. Are you still with us on Beyond the Silent Woods? If this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button and subscribe for more true horror from America's past. Drop a comment telling us where you're listening from and whether you're brave enough to finish this tale. The presence of these items near the Sullivan property raised immediate questions about the fate of several individuals who had disappeared while traveling through the region during the winter months. Helen and James Parker had been traveling from Knox County to visit relatives in Blount County when they disappeared during a late February snowstorm. Their disappearance had been reported to authorities, but search efforts had been hampered by severe weather conditions. The discovery of Helen Parker's distinctive shawl near the Sullivan property raised immediate and terrifying questions about the fate of the missing couple. Additional personal effects found in the area included items belonging to Richard Henderson, a traveling merchant who had failed to arrive at his scheduled destination in March, and personal papers identifying a Methodist preacher named Michael Collins, who had been reported missing while traveling his circuit during the winter months. The accumulation of personal effects from multiple missing individuals in one location could not be explained by coincidence or natural causes. Reynolds immediately sought out Dr. Morrison and Jacob Carter to report his discovery. The three men, along with Reverend Bradford and several other community members, returned to the creek area to conduct a more thorough investigation. Additional searching revealed more personal items, including pocket watches, traveling bags, and documentation that confirmed the identities of several missing individuals. Most disturbing was the discovery of what appeared to be recently disturbed earth at multiple locations between the creek and the root cellar. The areas of disturbance were rectangular in shape and approximately 6 feet in length, strongly suggesting burial sites. The positioning of these areas, combined with the presence of personal effects from missing travelers and the ongoing strange behaviors exhibited by Margaret, forced the community to confront the possibility that they were dealing with something far worse than grief-induced delusion. Dr. Morrison organized an immediate confrontation with Margaret, this time with sufficient witnesses, and resolved to demand answers about the discoveries near the creek. On April 20th, 1898, a group of 8 men approached the Sullivan property with the intention of conducting a thorough investigation regardless of Margaret's objections. They found her working behind her house, engaged in what appeared to be extensive digging near the root cellar. The amount of excavated earth was far beyond what would be necessary for normal spring maintenance or food storage preparation. When the men approached, Margaret stopped her work and regarded them with an expression that Dr. Morrison later described as calculating rather than surprised, as if she had been expecting such a visit. The men explained their concern for her welfare and their desire to offer assistance as she prepared for another year of widowhood, but their primary purpose was to question her about the personal effects that had been discovered near her property. Margaret's responses during this conversation revealed the depth of her psychological deterioration, while also raising disturbing questions about her activities during the winter months. When Dr. Morrison inquired about her health and whether she had been eating adequately, Margaret replied that she had been busy with important work and that maintaining proper household arrangements required more effort than most people understood. When asked to clarify what household arrangements required such extensive physical labor, she gestured toward the root cellar and stated that accommodating guests properly demanded significant preparation and ongoing maintenance. The questioning became more direct when Jacob Carter presented several of the personal items that had been found near the creek and asked Margaret to explain their presence on her property. Her response was both chilling and revealing. Those items belonged to visitors who decided they no longer had need for such possessions. When guests make arrangements for permanent stays, they typically leave their traveling effects behind. When pressed about where these visitors had gone after leaving their possessions, Margaret's explanation defied rational understanding. They didn't go anywhere. They found the accommodation so comfortable that they chose to remain indefinitely. Thomas explained to them the advantages of settling permanently in such a peaceful location, and they agreed that after difficult travels, they deserved rest in secure surroundings. Reverend Bradford attempted to clarify whether Margaret believed these visitors were still present on her property. Her response confirmed the worst fears of the investigating group. Of course they're still here. They're resting comfortably in their accommodations, and I maintain their needs just as any proper hostess would. Thomas oversees the arrangements and ensures that everyone remains satisfied with their permanent quarters. The conversation took an even more disturbing turn when Dr. Morrison asked directly whether Margaret understood that the missing individuals had families and obligations elsewhere that required their return. Her response revealed the complete extent of her delusion. Thomas convinced them that such obligations were less important than accepting hospitality that would ensure they never faced hardships again. Once he explained the benefits of permanent arrangements, they were eager to accept accommodations that would provide eternal comfort. Jacob Carter demanded that Margaret unlock the root cellar immediately and allow inspection of its contents to verify her claims about providing accommodations for guests. Instead of becoming defensive, Margaret smiled and agreed, stating that she was proud of the arrangements she had made for her extended household. As the group approached the cellar, the smell of decomposition became overwhelming. Margaret appeared completely unaffected by the odor and spoke cheerfully about the improvements she had made during the winter months. She explained that Thomas had provided detailed instructions for properly accommodating guests, and that she had followed his guidance precisely to ensure everyone remained comfortable. When Margaret unlocked the multiple heavy locks and opened the cellar door, the sight that greeted the men exceeded their worst fears and confirmed that they were dealing with crimes of unprecedented scope and horror. The root cellar, originally designed for food storage, had been converted into what could only be described as a charnel house containing the remains of multiple individuals. The cellar had been expanded significantly during the winter months, extending deep into the hillside and creating multiple chambers connected by narrow passages. Along the walls of these chambers, arranged in organized rows, were the decomposing remains of at least 9 individuals. The bodies had been positioned carefully, almost reverently, and each was surrounded by personal belongings and small offerings of food, as if Margaret had been maintaining some grotesque form of hospitality toward the dead. James and Helen Parker were clearly identifiable among the deceased, along with Richard Henderson, Michael Collins, and several other individuals who had been reported missing during the winter months. The condition of the remains suggested they had died at different times throughout the winter, indicating that Margaret's crimes had been committed systematically over an extended period. Most horrifying was the discovery of Thomas Sullivan's remains at the far end of the main chamber, positioned as if overseeing the others. His body showed evidence of careful preservation attempts, and unlike the other deceased, he appeared to have been regularly tended and repositioned. Around his body were arranged tools and household items, suggesting Margaret believed he continued to require these objects for daily activities. The chambers also contained evidence of the methods Margaret had used to kill her victims. Various tools were present that bore stains and damage consistent with use as weapons, and the positioning of some bodies suggested they had been restrained before death. However, the most disturbing aspect was the apparent care with which the victims had been arranged after death, as if Margaret genuinely believed she was providing them with comfortable accommodations. Margaret, observing the men's horror at her arrangements, seemed genuinely confused by their negative reaction. She explained that during the winter, when travelers sought shelter from severe storms, Thomas had communicated with her through dreams with instructions for providing permanent accommodations to ensure guests would never again face the hardships of travel through dangerous mountain conditions. According to her detailed account, each person had agreed to stay permanently after Thomas appeared to them during their sleep and explained the benefits of remaining in such a peaceful location. She insisted that she had provided excellent hospitality and that her guests were very comfortable in their permanent arrangements. The presence of food offerings and carefully arranged personal belongings demonstrated her continued belief that she was fulfilling proper hostess duties toward living guests. Dr. Morrison, recognizing the full scope of the tragedy, immediately organized the removal of the remains while other community members restrained Margaret, who became increasingly agitated as her guests were taken away. She repeatedly insisted that removing the bodies was extremely rude and that Thomas would be very angry about the disruption of his social arrangements. The investigation revealed that Margaret had been systematically murdering travelers who sought shelter during winter storms. Convinced that her deceased husband was directing these actions through supernatural communication, her mental deterioration combined with complete isolation had created a delusional system in which providing permanent hospitality represented the ultimate expression of mountain generosity. Sheriff's deputies summoned from Sevier County arrived on May 2, 1898, to arrest Margaret and conduct a formal investigation. Additional searching of the property revealed evidence of at least 4 more burial sites beyond those discovered in the cellar, suggesting the total number of victims exceeded 13 individuals. Most appeared to be travelers who had sought shelter during severe weather conditions throughout the winter months. The formal investigation uncovered additional disturbing details about Margaret's methods and motivations. Personal papers found in the house revealed that she had been maintaining detailed records of her guests, including their arrival dates, personal information, and her assessments of their suitability for permanent accommodations. These records demonstrated a level of premeditation and organization that contradicted any claims of impaired mental capacity. More chilling were the letters she had written to her sister Catherine in Kentucky throughout the winter, describing her busy social season and her satisfaction with entertaining more visitors than ever before. These letters, written in a cheerful tone, described elaborate meals and social activities that existed only in her delusional reality, but they also contained enough accurate details about her victims to serve as inadvertent confessions to their murders. Margaret's trial, held in Sevier County Circuit Court in July 1898, attracted significant attention throughout Tennessee and neighboring states. Her defense attorney, appointed by the court, attempted to argue that her actions resulted from severe mental illness brought on by grief and isolation. However, the systematic nature of her crimes and the evidence of careful planning made such arguments difficult to sustain. During testimony, Margaret maintained her belief that her actions had been directed by her deceased husband and that she had provided appropriate hospitality to traveling guests. She showed no recognition that murder had been committed, insisting that her guests had voluntarily chosen to remain permanently after Thomas explained the advantages of such arrangements. The trial testimony revealed additional disturbing details about Margaret's psychological state and the development of her delusional system. Dr. Morrison testified about her mental deterioration and his professional opinion that prolonged isolation had exacerbated underlying psychological instability. However, his testimony also acknowledged that her crimes demonstrated clear understanding of concealment and deception, suggesting retained capacity for rational planning. Reverend Bradford provided testimony about his February visit and Margaret's references to guests and accommodations that had seemed delusional at the time, but now appeared to be accurate descriptions of her criminal activities. His account of her calm demeanor and apparent pride in her hospitality arrangements provided crucial evidence about her psychological state during the commission of her crimes. The prosecution successfully argued that, regardless of her mental state, Margaret had demonstrated a clear understanding of wrongdoing through her efforts to conceal her crimes, and deceive community members about her activities. The systematic nature of her targeting of vulnerable travelers and her careful disposal of evidence indicated rational planning that exceeded what would be expected from someone completely detached from reality. Margaret was convicted on multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death by hanging. Throughout the trial and sentencing, she maintained her delusions about providing hospitality to grateful guests, showing no recognition that her actions constituted crimes. Her final statement to the court expressed regret only that her social arrangements had been disrupted and her guests had been rudely removed from their comfortable accommodations. The sentence was carried out on November 19, 1898, in Sevier County, according to newspaper reports preserved in the Knoxville Journal archives. She maintained her delusions until the end, insisting that Thomas was waiting for her and that her guests would miss her careful attention to their needs. If you've made it this far through this deeply disturbing true story, we need you to do something for us here at Beyond the Silent Woods. Hit that subscribe button, give us a like, and most importantly, comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Your engagement helps us bring more forgotten horror stories to light. The Sullivan property was abandoned immediately following Margaret's arrest. Community members burned the house and attempted to fill in the root cellar, trying to erase all evidence of the tragic events that had occurred there. However, the scope of the excavation work made complete filling impossible, and the location remained marked by depressions and unusual soil conditions that persisted for decades. The psychological impact of Margaret's crimes on the Ravens Hollow community was profound and lasting. Several families moved away from the area following her trial, unable to continue living in proximity to the site where such horrors had occurred. Those who remained found their sense of security and trust permanently damaged by the knowledge that such systematic evil could develop undetected within their midst. The case also raised disturbing questions about how many similar crimes might have occurred throughout the isolated regions of the Smoky Mountains, without ever being discovered or reported. The tendency of mountain communities to handle their own affairs with minimal outside interference, combined with the harsh geographical conditions that made communication and travel difficult, created circumstances where systematic criminal activity could continue undetected for extended periods. In 1925, a mining company surveying the region for coal extraction rights reported finding additional human remains near the former Sullivan property, suggesting that Margaret's victims may have been more numerous than officially documented. However, no formal investigation was conducted, and the site was incorporated into mining operations that permanently altered the landscape and destroyed any remaining evidence. The case of Margaret Sullivan was largely forgotten outside the immediate community until 1965, when University of Tennessee historian Professor David Bradford, grandson of Reverend Samuel Bradford, discovered his grandfather's detailed accounts while researching Smoky Mountain social history. Professor Bradford's subsequent investigation uncovered additional documentation that had been scattered among various family archives and county records. Professor Bradford's research, published in a limited academic journal in 1970, revealed that the Sullivan case was part of a broader pattern of isolation-induced psychological breakdowns that occurred throughout the Appalachian region during the late 19th century. His work documented similar cases in remote mountain communities, where extended winter isolation combined with personal trauma created conditions conducive to severe mental disturbance. Most significantly, Professor Bradford's investigation uncovered evidence suggesting that Margaret's crimes may have been facilitated by a previously unknown tradition of hospitality murders that occurred sporadically throughout the region. His research identified at least 7 similar cases between 1878 and 1903, all involving isolated individuals who systematically killed travelers under the guise of providing shelter during severe weather. The psychological profile that emerged from Professor Bradford's research painted a disturbing picture of how extreme isolation combined with personal loss and harsh environmental conditions could create perfect circumstances for catastrophic mental breakdown. Margaret's case became a landmark study in understanding the psychological effects of geographic and social isolation on vulnerable individuals. However, Professor Bradford's research was cut short in 1970 when he suffered a severe psychological breakdown during a field trip to investigate the former Sullivan property location. According to his research assistant, Professor Bradford became increasingly obsessed with details of the case and began experiencing what he described as auditory communications with historical figures involved in the events. The assistant's report filed with university administrators described how Professor Bradford spent several nights camping at the former property site, claiming he could hear voices from the old cellar providing additional information about Margaret's crimes. His final research notes, found in his tent after his hospitalization, consisted largely of incoherent references to continuing hospitality duties and diagrams showing planned excavation sites around the former property. Professor Bradford was institutionalized at Lakeshore Mental Health Institute, where he remained until his death in 1971. His research materials were archived by the university, but were later reported lost during a reorganization of historical documents. The official explanation was administrative error, but some colleagues suspected the materials were deliberately disposed of due to their disturbing content and the circumstances surrounding the professor's breakdown. Today, the former site of the Sullivan property lies within the boundaries of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Though the specific location is not marked or accessible to the public, park rangers occasionally report unusual incidents involving hikers who claim to hear sounds of digging or distant conversations coming from uninhabited areas of the park. Such reports are typically attributed to natural acoustic phenomena common in mountain environments. The case of Margaret Sullivan remains one of the most disturbing examples of isolation-induced psychological breakdown in documented Appalachian history. Her systematic murder of vulnerable travelers, combined with her elaborate delusions about providing permanent hospitality, illustrates the devastating effects that extreme social isolation can have on already fragile mental states. Modern psychological analysis of the case suggests that Margaret's crimes resulted from a complex combination of factors: unresolved grief, social isolation, harsh environmental conditions, and possible underlying mental illness that was exacerbated by prolonged stress. Her delusional system, while clearly pathological, followed an internal logic based on perverted concepts of mountain hospitality and family duty. The tragedy serves as a grim reminder of how geographic isolation, while offering certain advantages in terms of self-sufficiency and independence, can also create dangerous conditions for vulnerable individuals. The Appalachian region's history includes numerous examples of isolation-related psychological problems, though few reached the extreme level demonstrated in Margaret's case. Perhaps most disturbing is the evidence that Margaret's crimes might have continued indefinitely, if not for the chance discovery of her victims' personal effects by community members. Her systematic approach and careful concealment methods suggest that many similar crimes may have occurred throughout the region without ever being detected or documented. As night falls across the ancient ridgelines where Margaret once practiced her deadly hospitality, her story serves as a chilling reminder that the most terrifying evil can emerge from the most ordinary circumstances. In the end, the widow of Raven's Hollow created her own definition of eternal rest, ensuring that her guests would never again face the uncertainties of travel through the unforgiving mountains that had become their final destination. This has been Beyond the Silent Woods. If this story has left you unsettled, you're not alone. Subscribe to our channel, hit that like button, and comment below with your location and the time you're listening. We're documenting when and where these dark tales reach listeners around the world. Until next time, stay safe in the silent woods.